couple of years ago, we planted a tree in our backyard, kind of like in the little soil cup, but actually it was in the soil in the ground. Every day, close to, I would go out, take a look at it, see how it's doing, because it was just a little teeny twig. Didn't see any growth on it. Didn't know for sure if it was growing or not. Didn't know if we planted it correctly or gave it the right nutrients or were watering it too much or too little. Week after week, month after month, I don't know if it's growing. So I did something ridiculous one afternoon, and I went to it, and I pulled the trunk, and I pulled at it a little bit to see if I didn't pull too hard to make sure it was uprooted, but I wanted to see it. Of course, it wasn't rooted too much yet. It was just a few months. But I wanted to check. Then I checked to see if the branches were a little pliable or if they just would snap, because that's kind of a sign of life or death. Of course, it hadn't grown anymore. It was still just a little baby tree. And if I would have kept on pulling on it, that tree would definitely not have grown. It would have been kaput, dead. Not able to produce any shade or anything we wanted it to do. The problem wasn't the tree. Where was the problem? It was all with me, right? It was my impatience. I wanted growth faster than nature intended. I think that's how many of us approach God's promises, isn't it? God plants a promise in our hearts. He calls us to trust Him, to allow it to flourish and to grow. God tells us that He's at work behind the scenes. But somewhere between the promise and the fulfillment, we get tired of waiting. And instead of trusting God's process and the process of growing that promise in us, we start tugging on the tree. We try to speed things up. We try to make things happen. We try to even help God out. Here, God, here's a little boost. And the result is often not growth, but damage. Genesis 16 is one of the most relatable chapters in the entire Bible. Because it's about people, not about ones who stopped believing in God. They still believed in God, but it's about people who, even in their belief, stopped waiting for God. Tried to take some matters into their own hands. Abram and Sarai still believed in God's promises, that they would be father and mother to many nations, have many descendants. But they simply became convinced that God needed some assistance. And that's where many of us find ourselves. We trust God's power. We trust God's ability. We just don't always trust God's timing. And when God's timing feels slow, faith often begins to falter. Genesis 16 begins with a problem. God had promised Abram descendants as countless as the stars in the sky. I actually had a member look up how many stars are visible to the naked eye. Some of you might be able to guess which one would like to do that. He's actually not here today, so that narrows it down. It was under 5,000 to the naked eye. But obviously there's many more stars than just that. But the point is, God says, as countless, it's going to be many, countless descendants for Abram and Sarai. Yet, even with that promise, Sarai remained childless. She had no children. She wasn't able to bear children. And so the text that we read here in Genesis tells us Abram had already been living in the land of Canaan for 10 years. 10 years! 10 years of hoping. 10 years of waiting. 10 years of asking, Lord, now? When? And Sarai says something revealing. The Lord has kept me from having children. Notice what has happened. The delay has changed her perspective. She no longer sees the promise. She only sees the obstacle. And isn't that what waiting often does? Just sees the obstacle and not God on the other side, the promise that he made to you. Waiting can distort our view of God. Silence can feel like absence. Delays can start to feel like denial. Many of us know exactly what that feels like, don't we? You've prayed for healing. You've prayed for your child. You prayed for a spouse. You prayed for direction. You've prayed for restoration. And after a while, the waiting starts asking questions that faith struggles to answer. Where are you, God? Why haven't you acted? Have you forgotten about me? One of the greatest tests of faith is not suffering. It's waiting. Because waiting forces us to face and surrender control. To submit that control to God. As someone once said, a waiting room can become a war room of faith. The real battle isn't whether God can fulfill his promise. The real battle is whether we will trust him while we wait. So Sarai comes up with this plan. You heard it all in Genesis. It's an absolutely terrible plan. She suggests that her husband, Abram, take her maidservant, Hagar, as his wife, so that she can have children for him. Now, in the surrounding culture, this wasn't unusual. It was a normal thing. Among the Canaanites, arrangements like this happened all the time and were accepted. It was practical, it was common, it was even culturally approved. But just because something is culturally common doesn't make it right. Culture often normalizes what God never authorizes. And notice how familiar this story sounds. Just like in the Garden of Eden, someone proposes an alternative plan. Now, I'm not trying to say Sarai is the devil or the serpent, but she is the one that's questioning God's way. Someone takes matters into their own hands. We can speed up this process for you, God. Maybe this is how you wanted it to happen. So she reaches for what she thinks will solve the problem. And everything falls apart. The lie that Abram and Sarai believed was this: God needs our help. We can laugh at that. But how often have we really said that with our actions and our decisions? It's not happening the way I thought it was going to happen, so God, I'm going to step in here a little bit and help you along the way. Abram and Sarah, they believed God's promises. They simply decided God wasn't moving fast enough. And before we're too hard on them, we really need to recognize ourselves. How often have we justified bad decisions because they sounded practical? How many times have we said, well, this just makes sense. I've thought it through. I've planned it all. I know what God says, but many of our biggest regrets began as reasonable ideas. The affair, the dishonest business deal, the financial shortcut, that compromise, the relationship that we knew wasn't healthy, yet we went along with it anyways because it felt right. At that time, it seemed like the right thing. But shortcuts always have consequences. One powerful saying I recently heard says this: the shortcut you take to avoid pain often creates deeper pain. Abram and Sarai wanted to solve the problem. One problem. And in the process of trying to solve it, you know what they did? They created many more problems. Because human solutions without God's direction always produce human-sized disasters. If God promised it, God does not need manipulation to accomplish it. What happens next is heartbreaking. Hagar becomes pregnant. Sarai becomes bitter. Abram becomes passive. Hagar becomes mistreated. Every single one of the people in the story gets hurt. That's because sin never stays contained. Never. Private impatience becomes public pain. The one decision that Sarai and Abraham agreed to, has many ripple effects that impact everyone around them. Think about a crack in a windshield. Oh, those dreaded cracks in the windshield. Just a little teeny sliver that starts. Not a big deal. Till months later. Spreads over the whole windshield, covers the whole thing. What seemed like nothing, barely noticeable, becomes an insurmountable fix. Same thing with shortcuts in our lives. What begins as small shortcuts eventually affects marriages, families, workplaces, children, friendships. And in fact, you know the one decision that Abram and Sarah made? We're still seeing the consequence of their decision today. Across the entire world. From Genesis 16, thousands of years later, still the effect of their decision rings true today. The hostility that is described between Ishmael's descendants and Isaac's descendants echoes throughout history and even into our modern world in the Middle East today. One impatient decision created generations of pain. Friends, never underestimate the influence of your decisions. The people around you often absorb the fallout. Your faith doesn't just affect you. Your compromises don't just affect you. The people around you often absorb the fallout. And perhaps some of us know exactly what that feels like. Maybe you're carrying wounds around with you from decisions you've made years ago. Maybe you're still paying the price for trying to take control of God's timing. Maybe your family tree bears scars from shortcuts that seemed wise at the time for your ancestors. And if that's where you're at today, Genesis 16 has good news. Because the story isn't really about Abram's failure. The story is about God's faithfulness. The emotional center of this whole story isn't Abram. It isn't Sarai. It's Hagar, the maidservant, the one who was used, who was discarded, who was abused, who even ran into the desert. That's who this story is all about. In the desert is where God finds her. Notice the wording. The angel of the Lord found Hagar. She wasn't looking for God. God was looking for her. Many scholars recognize that the angel of the Lord term here is the pre-incarnate Christ. The visual appearance of God before Bethlehem, before he's born. Think about that. God himself comes into the wilderness and finds a forgotten servant girl. The God of the universe steps into her pain. And he asks, "Where have you come from? And where are you going?" Not because he didn't know. He knew. But he wanted her to know that she matters to him. That she's seen. That she's heard. That she's not forgotten. That God has found her. And Hagar responds by giving God a new name, El Roi, which means the God who sees me. What a beautiful confession from Hagar, the servant girl. Not the God who ignores me, not the God who forgot me, not the God who abandoned me, which is what her bosses did. No, she calls him the God who sees me. Maybe that's the word that someone needs today. That God sees you. You feel overlooked, invisible, exhausted, forgotten. People may even overlook you. But dear friend, heaven has not lost sight of you. His eyes are on you. He knows what you're going through. He loves you, and he has found you. The wilderness is not evidence of God's absence. Sometimes the wilderness of life becomes the exact and very place where God makes himself known to you. Here's what we find in Genesis 16 and what I love about it. Absolutely no person looks good. They all look bad in it. Abram fails. Sarai fails. Hagar struggles. Everyone is messy. Everyone is broken. Everyone needs grace. And God keeps showing up. That's the story of the Bible. Human failure, then divine faithfulness. Again and again and again. Abram's failure did not cancel God's covenant. Sarai's impatience did not cancel God's promise. And Hagar's pain didn't cancel God's compassion. And your failures cannot cancel God's grace. Some people carry tremendous shame. You look back at decisions you wish that you could just fully undo. A relationship, a compromise, a season of rebellion, a moment of weakness. And you think, like Keith even said in our Bible study, sometimes I feel like I've messed up things too badly. Genesis 16 says otherwise. Your failure may complicate your story, but it cannot cancel God's grace. Faith may falter, but God never does. God is still faithful while his people are still figuring it out. Ultimately, this chapter points us to Jesus. Abram failed to protect the vulnerable. He just allowed her to be more vulnerable. Jesus protects the vulnerable. He died for the vulnerable. Hagar was cast out into the wilderness. Jesus brings in all those who are cast out and welcomes them. Jesus becomes the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise. Even though humanity keeps trying to save itself, the only human who could save us was Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who takes away the sin of the world to fulfill the promise that he set out to make. The God who sees us is also the God who hears us, the God who comes to us, the God who forgives us. There may be consequences to our choices. There may be wounds that remain, scars that are visible and remind you of the past. But through Christ, there is forgiveness. Through Christ, there is a future. The God who found Hagar in the wilderness is the same God who meets us at the cross. There's a fascinating truth about butterflies. If you help a butterfly escape its cocoon too early, you actually weaken it. The struggle is what helps develop their strength to be able to fly. So if you speed up the process to get them out of the cocoon, they're not going to be able to fly and survive. Remove the struggle, and you remove the strength. Maybe God hasn't forgotten you. Maybe God isn't withholding from you. Maybe God is preparing you. Perhaps the waiting itself is that of a promise. Because God is not only preparing the promise for you, he's preparing you for the promise. So this week, ask yourself, what am I trying to force? Where am I trying to take control? What shortcut am I tempted to justify? And what would it look like to trust God's timing instead? Because when faith falters, God remains faithful. And the God who sees you is still leading you forward. Please stand. The peace of God, which transcends all our understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through faith in Christ Jesus. God is with you, dear friends.